In the middle of the 14th century, many people went to bed feeling healthy and woke up very sick. A fever came suddenly, without warning. Painful, dark lumps appeared under the arms and around the neck. Within just a few days, sometimes only hours, whole families died. Church bells rang so often that people stopped counting the dead. Graveyards quickly filled, with no space left for the living to mourn. Streets grew quiet, and fear spread across Europe. Everywhere, people asked the same frightening question: was this the end of the world? What they did not know was that they were living through the deadliest disease in human history. This terrible sickness would kill nearly half of Europe's people and change society forever. It became known as the Black Death. Once it began, there was no safe place to run. To understand how great the loss was, we must first look at the world before it happened. The early 14th century was not a dark age as many imagine. It was a time of growth and hope. Harvests were strong, families were large, and cities were expanding beyond their old Roman walls. In the early 1300s, cities like Paris, Florence, Venice, and London were full of life. The streets were crowded, noisy, and busy from morning until night. Great Gothic cathedrals rose high above the rooftops, showing faith, skill, and confidence. People felt closer to God and more advanced than any generation before them. The world was also deeply connected. A merchant in Venice could buy silk that had crossed all of Asia through trade routes protected by the Mongol Empire. Spices, gold, ideas, and new tools moved faster than ever before. But this connection had a dark side. The same ships and caravans that brought wealth would soon carry disaster. Far away, in the open lands of Central Asia, near modern Kyrgyzstan and northern China, an unseen enemy was beginning its journey toward Europe. This land was a place of extremes. Wide grasslands stretched to the horizon. Winters were bitter cold, and summers were painfully hot. Here lived a deadly germ that had existed for thousands of years. It lived quietly among burrowing animals like marmots and ground squirrels. For a long time, it stayed far from large human towns. In the 1330s, that balance began to break. The climate changed. Food became scarce. Hungry animals moved closer to people, carrying infected fleas with them. The disease jumped from animals to humans at trading posts along the Silk Road. The first victims did not understand what was happening. They suffered high fevers, sickness, and painful swellings in the body. News traveled slowly, but fear spread faster than any caravan. By the early 1340s, frightening stories began reaching ports around the Mediterranean. Merchants spoke of great lands in the east falling silent. They told of deadly sickness, burning skies, and cities left empty in India, Tartary, and Mesopotamia. Europeans listened with fear, but also distance. These places felt far away, and many believed the disaster was God's punishment for foreign peoples. No one understood germs or disease. They did not know that the spices on their tables had traveled the same roads as death. Those roads led to the Crimean Peninsula, beside the Black Sea. There stood the rich port city of Kaffa, a colony of the Republic of Genoa. In 1346, the city was surrounded by the Golden Horde, led by Khan Johnny Beg. The Genoese defenders were skilled at protecting their city and bringing supplies by sea. For months, the siege around Kaffa dragged on with no clear winner. Then, a silent killer struck the camps outside the walls. The Mongol soldiers lived close together, with little cleanliness. Disease spread quickly among them. Men began to fall sick and die by the hundreds, then by the thousands. Their bodies darkened before death. and fear swept through the army. The Mongols were not losing to weapons, but to illness. Seeing his army fall apart, Johnny Beg made a terrible choice. He ordered the bodies of dead soldiers to be thrown into the city. Day after day, corpses flew over the walls. Inside Kaffa, horror followed. The sickness entered the city, carried by bodies and fleeing fleas. The strong walls had been broken from within. Panic spread through Kaffa. The wealthy Genoese merchants knew the city could not be saved. They turned to their greatest strength, their ships. 12 galleys filled with people, goods, and unseen sickness slipped out of the harbor. They sailed past the dying Mongol camps and headed for home. The ships passed through the Bosphorus and by Constantinople, which soon suffered the same fate. They entered the Mediterranean, the busy heart of European trade. At every port, the ships unknowingly carried death ashore. The first major port to fall was Messina. When dock workers approached, they found dead sailors, rotting decks, and survivors covered in painful black sores. The port officials of Messina understood the danger too late. They ordered the ships to leave at once, but the real carriers had already escaped. Black rats ran along the ropes onto the docks, and fleas went with them. Messina became Europe's first warning. It failed badly. The disease spread with frightening speed. Crowded homes and narrow streets made it worse. Within weeks, daily life fell apart. People fled into the countryside, spreading illness across the island. News of the Great Plague traveled fast. Other ports tried to close their harbors, but greed often won. Valuable ships were allowed in. By early 1348, great trading cities were suffering. Genoa was devastated. Venice, ruler of the Adriatic Sea, now faced possible collapse. The people of Venice, practical and experienced traders, tried something new. They created quarantine islands called lazarettos. Ships and crews had to wait 40 days before entering the city. It was an early form of public health, but for the first wave of disease, it came too late. Soon, Venice's gondolas carried the dead instead of goods. Bodies filled the quiet canals. From Italy, the sickness spread west to Marseille and east to Dubrovnik. Europe's coastline was no longer safe. Then the disease moved inland. It followed rivers like the Rhone and traveled old Roman roads. Great cities such as Paris, Florence, London, and Barcelona were crowded and unclean. When the plague arrived, it did not just kill people. It broke the city itself. To understand the fear of this time, we must remember that people had no modern science. Even the best doctors of the age were confused. At the University of Paris, learned physicians could not explain what was happening. They did not know about germs. They believed bad air caused disease. Some thought the planets, Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars, had poisoned the sky. Doctors gave advice that often made things worse. They told people not to bathe. They burned sweet-smelling wood to fight the air. They bled weak patients and cut open painful swellings. Nothing helped. People slowly realized their knowledge had failed them. This caused deep fear and despair. The writer Giovanni Boccaccio described the horror in Florence, where many died. Fear of sickness was so strong that families abandoned one another. The writer Giovanni Boccaccio described fathers leaving their children and wives leaving husbands to die alone. The sick were sealed inside their homes. Daily life came to a halt. There were no officials left to enforce laws. Courts closed. Bakeries stopped making bread. The busy sounds of the city disappeared. No carts, no shouting merchants. Only silence, broken by church bells ringing day and night. Soon, even the bell ringers died, and the bells were silenced to stop fear from spreading. The dead were too many to bury. Graveyards filled quickly, large pits were dug, and bodies were laid inside, one on top of another, covered with thin soil. In the 14th century, people saw no difference between the natural and spiritual worlds. Such a disaster could only mean one thing to them: God was punishing humanity. People crowded into cathedrals, praying to be saved. They marched together in large processions. Sadly, this only helped the sickness spread faster. Priests died just as quickly as everyone else. When prayers failed, fear turned into desperation. A harsh movement appeared across Northern Europe. It was called the Flagellant movement. Groups of men dressed alike walked from town to town. Twice a day, they gathered in public squares. They whipped themselves until they bled, hoping to punish their own bodies to calm God's anger. People watched in horror and fear. As deaths continued, many looked for someone to blame. They believed evil forces were at work. In places like the Holy Roman Empire and Spain, dangerous rumors spread. Innocent communities were accused of causing the plague, leading to terrible violence and suffering. Even when Pope Clement VI spoke out, the violence did not stop. He explained that Jewish people were dying from the plague just like Christians, but fear had taken control. Old hatred and panic led crowds to look for someone to blame. In cities such as Strasbourg, Mainz, and Cologne, entire communities were attacked and killed. The Black Death revealed not only sickness, but the darkest sides of human behavior. It did not affect only cities. Most people lived in the countryside, and the plague reached them too. It spread through refugees and traveling traders. In rural areas, the damage was slower but lasting. Many villages disappeared forever. The farming system collapsed as workers died, and daily life could no longer continue. Writers of the time described strange and frightening scenes in the countryside. Crops rotted in the fields because no one was left to harvest them. Sheep and cattle wandered without care, then died or turned wild when their keepers were gone. With fewer people around, wolves moved closer to villages. The land itself began to change. Fields and roads slowly returned to nature. By 1350, the plague had reached the far north, Scotland, Scandinavia, and even small settlements in Greenland. It had swept across the whole continent, from the warm Mediterranean to the frozen north. By 1351, the worst wave began to fade. There were simply fewer people left to infect. The land fell quiet. Europe emerged forever changed. In Europe alone, nearly half the population may have died in less than 5 years. Those who survived stepped into a world that looked familiar, but felt very different. At first, there was chaos. Prices rose, trade slowed, and many systems failed. Then something unexpected happened. With so many people gone, there were not enough workers. For the first time in generations, ordinary laborers had power. Landowners had to offer higher pay and better treatment. In many places, the old system of serfdom began to weaken and fall apart. Some called this a new age for working people. But the emotional wounds were deep. Art and stories focused on death. Images of kings, priests, and peasants all facing the grave became common reminders. The Black Death was the greatest shock Europe had ever known. It ended an age of confidence and showed how fragile human society truly is. The world that rebuilt itself was more cautious and more thoughtful. People learned they had to change in order to survive. The long path of loss cleared the way for the modern world we know today. For many years, the Black Death felt like a distant medieval nightmare. But empty streets, Locked homes and fear in the air feel familiar even now. The plague tested civilization, and history has a way of repeating its tests.